This is part 11 of the endocrine system, and I'm actually looking at two review papers from Cardiovascular Diabetology journal. That's what's listed right here, Cardiovascular Diabetology. This journal is found on PubMed Central, and it's in the biology section of PubMed Central, which means that all of these papers are fully available. We just went over this first paper, which was the very first issue of this particular journal. And so we can look up this issue right here. This is actually a URL right there, and you'll get this page as a handout, and you'll be able to go to that URL. There's another URL right here, this one, and it's basically this next paper, which came out a few years later after much effort and study, and it's a 2005 paper. This may seem rather old to you, but this is information that basically became very new in this last year when we created a new category of human organ as the interstitium. You might remember that from last year, but basically that's what's being looked at here, is the interstitium, and ever since maybe 1995 all the way through the past 20 or 25 years, this has been the major source of research. We have something here, a subtitle called The Matrix Preloaded. That's a time of when certain movies about the Matrix were being made at that time, and so it seemed like a good idea to call the paper that. But basically we're looking at endothelial matrix, and as we read through here, then in addition to these advanced glycosylated end products, which you can see right here, changes, basically it's glucose that actually binds along with cholesterol to create plaques and changes the actual structure of the basement membrane of endothelial cells that produce or making up the capillaries. And so the matrix has changed. Basically, instead of being a very delicate fretwork in which there's a passage of gases and essential nutrients, now we have something that looks a little bit more like poured concrete. And now it's difficult to send oxygen and exchange it for CO2 and have nutrients freely flowing across boundaries. And so the tissue is now stressed. And as indicated, it could happen at the retina most readily, it could happen at the kidney most readily, and it could also happen in the lower extremities near the feet, ankles, toes most readily. And so with that in mind, we actually would like to change the diet, really, and also the activities. So ultimately, we have these changes that are being described here in the abstract, which I invite you to read. And there's actually, historically, before the year 2000, we called metabolic syndrome Syndrome X because it was quite complex and included visceral obesity to the extent that some people actually were rather slender in most parts of their body, but their belly stuck out. And the adipose tissue of the visceral organs was becoming very significant. You might notice that in certain people who engage in alcoholic beverage drinking, and also just older people in general who eat to fullness. There is this interesting development in the belly region. Then we have hyperglycemia, which is elevated blood sugar. We have certain oxygen species that are reactive, low levels of nitric oxide, which is something we really need, lots of nitric oxide actually, hypertension, hyperinsulinemia, so many different difficulties, which ultimately the beauty of this paper is that it tells you how to solve the problem. And the problem was completely solved in this table, table 6 in this paper, and that's what I copied here. The positive protective effects of endothelial nitric oxide synthase. Okay, this is an enzyme. It's released at night, part of the nighttime cocktail, and it releases ultimately, it synthesizes actually endothelial nitric oxide, ENO. And what are the benefits of ENO? Let's take a look. It promotes vasodilation, which means that the walls become thinner, more fret-like, and there's a reduction in smooth muscle development. And so we can actually change hardened arteries to not hardened arteries with this. Amazing as it may seem, how do we get there? We actually eat things like broccoli as a staple, or spinach, or seaweed, that kind of thing, lots of omega-3. And ultimately we go for a walk and a run, and we do yoga and all of that kind of stuff. We calm down, we have less stress, psychological stresses, and bad stresses. We have a lot of good stresses, going out under the sky and walking and enjoying life, drinking a lot of water. So these would promote powerful sleep outcomes. Okay, then we're counteracting smooth muscle proliferation. That is to say, we're not hardening the arteries anymore. In fact, we're going the other way. Decrease platelet adhesion, so we're not producing a thrombosis. Decrease in adhesiveness of the endothelial layer to white blood cells. And it's called the Teflon effect. Then we have anti-inflammatory in general activities. Antioxidant, we're going to scavenge reactive oxygen species and basically protect membranes of cells throughout the region. Anti-fibrotic, nitric oxide is normal or elevated, and we get basically this is a little bit of alphabet soup here. You need to read the paper to understand some of this, but the idea here is to avoid certain redox reactions that result in problems that drive the thickening of the walls and the changing of the structure. So then they sort of do a collective thing here. It's anti-atherosclerotic and anti-inflammatory. So you can read this at the paper, and they discuss things. It's about looking at structure, molecular structure, in the endothelial matrix. So you'll be hearing, if you haven't already heard, enormous amounts of information about endothelial matrix, and you'll be becoming more familiar with metabolic syndrome. By 2011, the same announcement was made by World Health Organization, as was made by the CDC and the Surgeon General in America in 2002. So it's really become a world phenomenon. While it began in the United States in 2002 as a call to arms, as it were, a new kind of healthcare, the World Health Organization spoke on behalf of the entire world and began to notice that people were making food selections that were too refined, not whole foods, need to get back to fiber, ultimately, in the foods, not remove it, and not process the foods, not eat foods that are made from flours, in the way of breads and in the way of noodles and that kind of thing, and to return to whole vegetables, whole foods as a part of the menu. And of course, activity. There's something in the vicinity of 300 calories a day of exercise, something over 2,000, maybe 2,400 for men, 2,200 for women. So about maybe 3 miles of walking a day on average for the average individual would also play a role besides the change in diet. And then sleeping the full 8 hours in order to activate especially the endothelial nitric oxide. Okay, so that concludes the chapter on endocrine.